At 3:30 hours, June 17, 1944, on the western coast of Saipan, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito was certain he had won. 44 Japanese tanks, the largest armored force ever assembled for a single Pacific battle, were rolling directly into the American beachhead. His intelligence had assured him American Shermans burned. They were called Ronsons for a reason. Within 1 hour, Saito would watch his entire regiment turn to scrap, and not a single Sherman would burn at all. The Japanese claim had become doctrine. The M4 Sherman, they believed, was a death trap. Gasoline engine, thin side armor, one well-placed 47mm round, and it would light first time, every time, just like a Ronson cigarette lighter. Japanese pilots radioed Ronson when they spotted Shermans. Japanese infantry were trained to target them specifically. The problem, documented by armor historian Stephen J. Zaloga, was that this intelligence was already obsolete. The 47mm gun on the Type 97 Shinhodo Chiha, while effective against M3 Stuarts in 1942, could not reliably penetrate the Sherman's 64mm Glassy in 1944. At Saipan, the 2nd Marine Tank Battalion's M4A2S absorbed everything the 9th Tank Regiment fired. Not one was lost to enemy tank fire that night. The inversion was absolute. It was the Japanese Type 97s that burned. Their armor, designed in the 1930s, measured just 25mm at its thickest. American armor-piercing rounds passed completely through without detonating. The steel was too thin to trigger the fuse. The Marines had to adapt mid-battle, switching to high-explosive shells so the tanks would actually explode. Captain Frank Stewart of 2nd Tank Battalion was so focused on not hitting friendly infantry that he couldn't be bothered to count kills. His concern wasn't survival. It was collateral damage. How did the tank they called a cigarette lighter become the single most lethal weapon on Saipan, destroying nearly 100 enemy armored vehicles across the campaign while suffering almost none of its own? The answer is not in the steel. It's in what the Marines did with it. To understand why the 9th Tank Regiment charged into certain death, you have to understand what the Japanese believed about American tanks, and why that belief was already 20 years out of date. The Japanese believed they could win because memory had calcified into doctrine. The Type 97 Shinhodo Chiha Kai, with its new turret and higher velocity Type 147mm gun, was Japan's modernized medium tank, 15 tons, 25mm front armor, capable of 38 km per hour. In 1941-42, these tanks had crushed British armor at Slim River, where Japanese crews split the Argylls and Gurkhas and captured Kuala Lumpur with 13,000 prisoners. They had defeated American M3 Stuarts in the Philippines. Japanese tankers, veterans of Manchuria and China, believed the Sherman was simply a larger Stuart, more armor, yes, but still a gasoline engine, still vulnerable to flanking, still a Ronson waiting to ignite. An intercepted communication from a 9th Tank Regiment NCO, hours before Saipan, revealed their confidence. Our plan would seem to be to annihilate the enemy by morning. What Japanese intelligence missed was not the Sherman steel, but the system behind it. Between 1941 and 1945, Japan produced approximately 3,600 tanks. Peak annual output was 1,191 vehicles in 1942. The United States, in 1943 alone, manufactured 29,500 tanks, more than Germany produced in the entire war, and nearly 9 times Japan's total wartime production. This was not merely industrial disparity. It was doctrinal. Japanese tankers were trained for infantry support, not armored combat. Independent thinking was discouraged. Blind obedience was instilled. Field modification under fire was neither taught nor tolerated. Marine tankers, by contrast, were cross-trained as mechanics. They carried toolkits, modified ammunition types while being shot at, and integrated infantry, artillery, and naval gunfire into a single lethal combined arms system. Major James A. Donovan Jr., one of 6 Marines, watched the 9th Tank Regiment die. The Japanese tanks appeared confused. As their guides and crew chiefs were hit by Marine rifle and machine gun fire, what little control they had was lost. They ambled in the general direction of the beach, getting hit again and again until each one burst into flame. The Japanese had the numbers. They had the element of surprise. They even had the psychological advantage, because every one of their tankers believed American armor was overrated, under-armored, and ready to burn. But belief is not armor. And on the night of June 16, 1944, the 9th Tank Regiment was about to discover the difference. The weapon they called a cigarette lighter was, in technical fact, a diesel-powered counter-logistical miracle. The M4A2 Sherman, Fisher tank arsenal production, weighed 31.8 metric tons combat-loaded. Its armament, a 75mm M3L/40 gun with 97 rounds of mixed ammunition. Its armor, 64mm glacis at 43 degrees, 89mm gun mantlet, 38mm sides. Its engine, twin General Motors 6-71 diesel, 410 horsepower at 2,900 revolutions per minute. Range 241 kilometers on 673 liters of Navy Standard fuel. The Ronson nickname was a category error that Japanese intelligence never corrected. The M4A2 did not run on gasoline. It did not light first time every time, and on Saipan it would not burn at all. The men inside these machines were not career soldiers. They were farmers, mechanics, factory workers, and one 20-year-old Californian named Thomas O'Neill, who had enlisted a week after Pearl Harbor at age 17, survived Guadalcanal and Tarawa, and now commanded a Fisher-built M4A2 in 2nd Tank Battalion. Marine tankers were cross-trained as mechanics. They carried toolkits. They understood that doctrine was a starting point, not a straitjacket. Japanese tankers, brutalized into blind obedience, could not field modify under fire. Marines could and did. At 3:45, the first Sherman engaged a Type 97 Shinhodo. The armor-piercing round entered the Japanese tank's glacis. It exited through the engine compartment. The tank kept moving. At 3:50, Captain Frank Stewart received the radio reports. AP rounds are passing clean through. The enemy's armor is too thin to detonate our fuses. At 4 o'clock, Company A rewrote Marine Corps doctrine in 4 minutes without asking permission. The order crackled across the battalion net. Switch to high explosive. I say again, switch to HE. High explosive shells were designed for infantry and fortifications. Against 25mm Japanese steel, they detonated on contact. The tanks burned. Stewart's concern, documented by Ken Estes, was not kill count. It was collateral damage. He was more afraid of hitting his own infantry than of missing the enemy. At 3:30, the 9th Tank Regiment believed they were hunting Shermans. By 4 o'clock, they were the hunted. And the weapon that was supposed to be their greatest vulnerability had become their executioner. At 2 o'clock hours, June 17, 1944, Colonel Goto's 9th Tank Regiment moved into assault positions southwest of Hill 164.6. 44 Type 97 Shinhodo Chiha tanks, each carrying infantry of the 136th Regiment clinging to engine decks, turret baskets, handrails. Goto's order, recorded in post-war interrogation: charge the transmitting station. Throw the enemy into disorder. Annihilate them by morning. The Americans heard them first. Not gunfire. Engines. Low, grinding diesel rumble carrying across the volcanic slopes of central Saipan. Multiple engines. Moving into formation. A request crackled up the chain to the Navy. Illumination rounds. Now, at 3:15, the sky turned daylight. U.S. Navy destroyers laid star shells across the perimeter. The darkness dissolved. The coastal plain between Hill 164.6 and the beach became, in an instant, impossibly bright. What the Marines saw: 44 Japanese tanks. Infantry swarming on their decks. Bugles sounding. Officers standing in open turrets, waving swords over their heads. At 3:30, Japanese tanks rolled into range of Company B, 1/6th Marines. Captain C.G. Rollin called for armored support. Company A, 2nd Tank Battalion moved forward, Fisher-built M4A2 diesels answering the call. At 3:45, the proof of concept was fired. Sherman A-22, gunner's sight picture, 300 meters, frontal aspect, Type 97 Shinhodo turret visible. First round, M61 armor-piercing capped. Direct hit, center mass. The round penetrated the 25mm glacis. It exited through the engine compartment. The tank kept rolling. Inside, the crew was likely dead, shredded by spall, but the vehicle remained mobile. Marine reaction, captured in radio transcripts. What does it take to stop these things? At 3:48, the adaptation began. Radio chatter across the battalion net. AP goes right through. Try he. The loader pulled M48 high explosive from the ready rack. Second round. Impact on the turret ring. Detonation. The turret dislodged. Crew compartment fire. The tank stopped. It burned. Proof established in 4 minutes. Armor piercing is for European tanks with thick armor. High explosive kills Japanese tanks. This is the Pacific. In the first 30 minutes of engagement, the results quantified. 12 Japanese tanks destroyed by Shermans and bazookas. Hundreds of Japanese infantry stripped from their tanks by Marine machine guns and artillery. 0 Shermans lost to enemy fire. Doctrine adaptation speed. Less than 15 minutes from identification to battalion-wide implementation. Japanese tankers, trained to believe Shermans were vulnerable gasoline coffins, watched their regimental comrades burn. Some tanks became disoriented in the sudden brightness, drove into swamps, immobilized themselves easy targets. Donovan watched it unfold. The battle evolved itself into a madhouse of noise, tracers, and flashing lights. As tanks were hit and set afire, they silhouetted other tanks coming out of the flickering shadows. The first 12 kills proved the tactical adaptation worked. But the Japanese were still coming. Colonel Goto had committed his entire regiment. Retreat was not an option. What happened next was no longer a battle, it was an abattoir. The Japanese adapted, but adaptation requires time, and time was measured in burning tanks. Between 3:30 and 5 o'clock, 3 desperate enemy adjustments all failed. First, infantry separation. Marine artillery and machine guns systematically stripped Japanese infantry from tank decks. Tanks arrived at American lines alone, unsupported. Second, command decapitation. Japanese tank commanders, exposed in open turrets to see in the darkness, were picked off by Marine riflemen. Donovan documented the collapse. As their guides and crew chiefs were hit, what little control they had was lost. Third, terrain disorientation. Star shells and burning tanks created shifting shadows. Japanese drivers, reliant on visual navigation, drove into marshes, ditches, and directly into American kill zones. The American counter-adaptation was simpler, faster, and permanent. At 4 o'clock, the ammunition doctrine of the United States Marine Corps was rewritten on a battalion radio net. Pre-Saipan, AP for tanks, he for soft targets. Post-Saipan, he for everything. AP is for Europe. Every subsequent Japanese tank kill by 2nd Tank Battalion used M48 high explosive. Armor-piercing racks went untouched for the rest of the night. Shermans stopped fighting as independent tank killers. They integrated with bazooka teams, drawing fire while infantry flanked. They called naval gunfire onto retreating armor. They used burning Japanese tanks as illumination sources to track follow-on waves. At 4:15, a Japanese tank passed directly over a Marine foxhole. The Marine stayed low, unharmed. The tank's oil pan leaked, drenching him in hot lubricant. As the tank passed, the Marine jumped up and rammed a coconut log into the bogey wheels. The tank spun in place, immobilized. The commander opened his turret to investigate. The Marine threw a thermite grenade inside. The tank blew up like a volcano. At 4:30, Captain Norman K. Thomas took command after Rollin was wounded by concussion. He advanced to direct tank fire. He was struck and killed by fire from a Japanese tank. Sergeant Dean Squires did not pause. He shot the Japanese commander, placed a demolition charge on the enemy tank's deck, and disabled it. Navy Cross. The countdown was arithmetic. 3:30, 44 tanks operational. 4 o'clock, 32 operational. 5 o'clock, 18 operational. 6 o'clock, 8 operational. 6:30, 0 operational in the Marine sector. Survivors fled toward Garapan. By dawn, the 9th Tank Regiment had ceased to exist as a fighting force. But the Marines didn't stop to count bodies. At 7:30, they did something that still amazes military historians. They picked up their rifles and continued the attack. By 4:45, any rational commander would have withdrawn. The 9th Tank Regiment had lost half its strength. Infantry support was annihilated. The element of surprise was long gone. Japanese counter-battery fire had failed to silence Marine artillery. American guns never stopped. Colonel Goto did not withdraw. Why? The search results offer no direct quote from Goto, because he did not survive to write an after-action report. But the tactical record tells us what happened next. At 4:50, approximately 18 surviving Japanese tanks, many damaged, some with dead commanders slumped in open turrets, formed for one last charge. They had no artillery. They had no infantry. They had no maneuver room. Marshes channeled them into kill zones. They came anyway. The environment was their enemy. Darkness compromised by star shells, terrain littered with burning hulks that blocked maneuver. Each wave of attackers advanced through the graveyard of their own regiment. Captain Frank Stewart faced a different enemy. His Shermans were winning, but Marine infantry and Japanese tanks were now intermingled in the forward foxhole line. A 75mm He round does not discriminate. One misfire into a friendly position could kill a dozen Marines. Stewart's order, documented by Ken Estes: cease fire unless you have a confirmed target and clear background. This is why he could not give a kill count. He was too busy preventing his own men from killing each other. The Shermans proved their endurance between 5 o'clock and 6:30. Some fired over 100 rounds that night, exceeding their standard combat load. Gunners rotated to prevent barrel overheating. Crews hand-loaded ammunition for 6 hours. 0 mechanical failures compromised combat effectiveness. 0 losses to enemy tank fire. This requires precision. The Type 97 Shinhodo's 47mm gun could penetrate Sherman side armor at 500 yards or less. Zaloga confirms this. But at Saipan, Marines never presented the side armor. Combined arms, infantry protection, bazooka teams, artillery, prevented flanking. The system protected the tank. The myth of the Ronson died here not because Japanese guns were weak, but because American tactics were superior. Not one Sherman was knocked out by Japanese tank fire during the June 16, 17 counterattack. At 5:30, one Japanese tank survived the night assault, rolling away into the eastern hills. At 7 o'clock, a Marine shore fire control officer spotted it maneuvering on a hilltop. He radioed a destroyer offshore. 20 salvos of 5-inch naval gunfire. The tank became just a mess of scrap iron, but the telephone was still intact and ringing. The numbers vary by source. Estes, 31 to 36 destroyed that night. Hoffman, decimated. Dacus, 31 counted. The consensus: of 44 tanks committed, approximately 31 to 36 burned between 3:30 and 6:30. The remainder fled toward Garapan. 0 Shermans lost to enemy tank fire. Across the entire Saipan campaign, American armor destroyed approximately 100 Japanese tanks. When the sun rose on June 17th, the 9th Tank Regiment was finished. But something else had died that night, the myth of the Ronson. And in its place rose a new understanding. The Sherman was not a death trap. It was the most lethal weapon on the island. 1 month after the battle, with Saipan still not fully secured, Major James A. Donovan Jr. sat down and wrote what he had seen. His letter, dated July 18, 1944, is not polished after-action prose. It is raw, immediate, and definitive. We really stopped them. One of our men stuck a log in the tread of a tank and stopped it dead. When its JAPE commander threw open the tank hatch, the boys tossed in a grenade. Our battalion anti-tank company then got into action and knocked out every enemy tank. We ourselves got lead into half of them with grenades and bazookas. The count was stark. 31 Japanese tank carcasses littered the 2nd Marine Division sector. Approximately 1,000 Japanese dead. Jones, the division historian, wrote, "If the Japanese attack on June 17th had been successful, it would have been fatal to the division's fighting efficiency. Pre-Saipan, the institutional belief was clear. Shermans were adequate but vulnerable. European theater dominated tank development. Pacific tankers made do with hand-me-downs and light tanks. Post-Saipan, that belief was ash. Shermans had just destroyed an entire Japanese tank regiment. They did it with ammunition not designed for anti-tank work. They did it without losing a single vehicle to enemy fire. The question wrote itself: if the Sherman is a Ronson, what do we call the tanks it just incinerated? On June 20th, Captain Frank Stewart sat for an informal after-action interview. He was asked to estimate kills. He could not. Estes documented why. His concern at the time was to keep his tankers from firing on friendly positions in midst of the chaos. Getting a kill count was secondary. On June 25th, 2nd Tank Battalion submitted its formal report. The recommendation was unambiguous. Maintain He as primary anti-tank round for Pacific operations. By July 1944, the tactical lessons of Saipan were circulating to Marine divisions preparing for Guam, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima. 2 key lessons, typed and mimeographed, entered the Pacific pipeline. Lesson 1. Japanese tanks are lightly armored. Armor-piercing rounds may overpenetrate. High explosive ammunition is effective and should be employed. Lesson 2. Marine tankers demonstrated ability to adapt tactical doctrine without higher direction. This initiative should be encouraged. The adaptation spread. On June 24th, Company C, 2nd Tank Battalion destroyed 7 Japanese tanks near Garapan, using He. On July 7th, during a mass banzai attack, 3rd Battalion, 10th Marines artillerymen knocked out 3 Japanese tanks at point-blank range using howitzers with cut fuses. By the time Saipan was declared secure, approximately 100 Japanese tanks had been destroyed on the island. 44 on the night of June 16th to 17th. The rest hunted down over the following 3 weeks. But the lesson of Saipan did not stay on Saipan. The men who fought that night took what they learned to every remaining island in the Pacific. And the weapon that was supposed to be their greatest liability became their signature advantage. 34 days after Saipan, on July 21, 1944, the remaining companies of the 9th Tank Regiment, approximately 29 Type 95 Hagos and 11 Type 97s, awaited the American landing on Guam. They had dug in, concealed their hulls in revetments, and planned a massed counterattack to throw the invaders into the sea. The Marines landing on Guam included tankers who had transferred from Saipan. They carried the lessons of June 17th not in manuals, but in their heads. Result: 4th Marines Tank Company destroyed 4 Type 95s in the first counterattack. 2 days later, 5 more burned. 1 Marine Sherman killed a Japanese tank at what was reported as 2,240 yards, possibly the longest-range tank kill of the entire Pacific War. The Japanese commander's planned mass assault never materialized. His tanks got lost in the jungle trails. The paper trail followed the men. By late 1944, revised Marine Corps tank publications included new sections: Target Characteristics, Japanese Armor, expanded guidance on using high explosive against thin-skinned vehicles, a case study on the Saipan ammunition shift. Crew-level mechanical training, already emphasized, became mandated, a direct doctrinal contrast to Japanese practice, where tankers were taught obedience, not adaptation. The equipment legacy was quieter but permanent. The M4A2 Sherman, powered by twin GM diesels, had been unwanted by the U.S. Army. The Marines took it anyway: Navy fuel compatibility, less flammable than gasoline. Saipan provided empirical evidence. Diesel Shermans didn't burn the way propaganda claimed. Post-1944, diesel variants remained the Marine Corps preference for Pacific operations. Every subsequent Pacific tank engagement involving American armor included He in the ready rack for anti-tank work. Iwo Jima, Shermans used high explosive against bunkers, caves, and the rare armor contact. Okinawa, the Japanese fielded fewer than 20 tanks. Those that appeared were destroyed, often by He. At the battle's end, Major General Lemuel Shepard wrote, "If any one supporting arm can be singled out as having contributed more than any others during the progress of the campaign, the tank would certainly be selected." Captain Ed Bale commanded Company C, 2nd Tank Battalion at Garapan on June 24, 1944. 7 Japanese tanks destroyed in a single engagement, all with he. Decades later, interviewed by Marine Corps historians, he was asked who deserved credit for the kills. His answer was not about who fired the shots. It was about the regiment, the battalion, the men who adapted together. The argument was never settled. The point was that the 9th Tank Regiment was destroyed. Colonel William K. Jones, Willie K., commanded one of 6 Marines through the tank attack and the rest of Saipan. He retired as a lieutenant general. In 1988, Leatherneck magazine published his account. The coconut log incident, the thermite grenade, the destroyer with the ringing telephone, all of it entered the permanent record. The tactical legacy is clear. But the cultural legacy, the death of the Ronson myth, took longer to die than the 9th Tank Regiment. Even today, the nickname persists. The documentary record, however, tells a different story. The personal ledger is uneven. Colonel Go-To, 9th Tank Regiment, died on Saipan with his tanks. Decades later, a Type 97 Shinhodo recovered from the battlefield was placed at Yasukuni Shrine's Yushikin Museum, a monument to tankers who fought to the last man. Captain Norman K. Thomas took command after Rollin was wounded, advanced to direct fire, and was struck and killed. Navy Cross posthumous. Sergeant Dean Squires, Corporal Donald Watson, PFC's Charles Merritt, Herbert Hodges, and Robert Reed received Navy Crosses for destroying Japanese tanks with bazookas, grenades, and demolition charges. Some killed tanks with their sidearms after exhausting their rockets. The Sherman crews of Company A received no Navy Crosses, no Medal of Honor. They just did their jobs. Switched ammunition, killed 30-plus tanks, saved the beachhead, and stayed too busy preventing friendly fire to count their kills. 3 tactical propositions were proven that night. First, massed armor is useless without combined arms. The Japanese had 44 tanks and thousands of infantry, but Marine artillery and machine guns separated them. The tanks died alone. Second, tactical adaptation outranks doctrine. The switch from AP to he took 15 minutes. No staff study, no division approval, no permission, just tankers solving a problem. Third, the Sherman was not the problem. The problem was the belief that the Sherman was the problem. The technical gap was unbridgeable. Japan produced approximately 3,600 tanks between 1941 and 1945. The United States produced over 88,000. Japan's most modern tank, the Type 97 Shinhodo, carried 25 mm armor. The Sherman's glacis was 64 mm. But the Marines didn't even need the armor advantage. They won by outthinking, not out-armoring. At Marine Corps University, Quantico, Saipan is taught as a case study in tactical initiative and mission command. The lesson, distilled across 70 years. Subordinate leaders identified a problem, armor-piercing rounds over-penetrating, and implemented a solution, switched to high explosive, without waiting for higher approval. This is the standard to which we train. The myth persists. Shermans were death traps. Ronsons, Tommy Cookers. The Japanese called them that, and it must be true. The truth is that the Japanese called them that because they wanted to believe it. Belief was all they had. Their armor was obsolete. Their industry was overwhelmed. Their tactics were 30 years old. At Saipan, the myth met the M4A2. The myth burned. The Sherman advanced. The records show one clear conclusion from that night of fire and steel. The tank they called a cigarette lighter did not light. It extinguished. And in doing so, it wrote the obituary of Japanese armored warfare. The numbers that matter: 44 Japanese tanks committed to the largest armored attack of the Pacific War. 0 U.S. Shermans lost to enemy tank fire that night. 31 to 36 Japanese tanks destroyed before dawn. Approximately 100 total Japanese tanks destroyed on Saipan by American armor. 1 coconut log improvised as an anti-tank weapon. 1 telephone, left intact on a destroyed tank, still ringing. 1 radio call changed everything. Switch to he. Not a general. Not a colonel. Not a doctrine manual. A tank commander. watching his armor-piercing rounds pass through enemy steel like a hot knife through rice paper, making a simple observation. That's not working. Try this. 15 minutes later, the 9th Tank Regiment was burning. In 2025, the United States Marine Corps deactivated its last tank battalions. The debate continues. Does the modern battlefield need heavy armor? Saipan offers an answer that transcends technology. It was never about the tank. It was about the tankers. The Japanese had tanks. They had numbers. They had the better anti-armor gun. What they did not have was crews who understood their weapons mechanically. Leaders who adapted doctrine in real time. Integration with infantry, artillery, and naval support. The simple, stubborn refusal to believe propaganda over evidence. Every field has its Ronson myth. Some piece of equipment, some method, some conventional wisdom that everyone knows is inadequate. Everyone knows Shermans burn. Everyone knows you can't fight armor with high explosive. Everyone knows one man can't change doctrine. Everyone was wrong. At 3:30 on June 17, 1944, the Japanese 9th Tank Regiment believed they were hunting the most vulnerable tank on the battlefield. By 6:30, they had learned the truth. The Sherman was not a Ronson. The Sherman was the hunter. And on that volcanic hillside, under the light of burning Type 97s, 44 Japanese tanks discovered what the Marine Corps already knew. It is not the weapon that wins battles. It is the willingness to throw away the manual and find out what actually works. Military archives prove. One determined crew with the right ammunition, and the intelligence to switch to it, can destroy an entire regiment, change tactical doctrine, and send a propaganda nickname back to the enemy as a eulogy. The 9th Tank Regiment is scrap metal and museum pieces now. The lesson of Saipan is not,